Welcome to Native Exiles, Alderwood Community Church's podcast, where we talk about following Jesus in the tension of being in the world, but not of it. And we're diving into one aspect of being in the world today, which is raising kids in this world, raising kids who will grow up to follow Jesus with their lives and become mature adults, or at least that's the goal. And yet it's so complex, it's so hard, it's so humbling to be parents. Whether you're a parent or not, I think you're going to find this to be an engaging conversation. I hope it's helpful to you. Let's jump in. Steve, it's good to be back with you, man.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun getting some feedback on our technology series, too. A lot of people seem to have enjoyed it. It's been challenging for me trying to live it out.
I ran into somebody from church after that technology episode had come out, and they had listened to it, and I had my headphones in while I was eating lunch at the mall, and she was like, I caught you.
Busted.
So, yeah, it's an ongoing battle for all of us.
You were watching breakdancing cats on YouTube. I know how you are.
But yeah, so we're kind of dovetailing off of that. We're talking about parenting now and going to do a few episodes on this, but kind of the big conversation we're going to have today as we get started is talking about one aspect of parenting that, whether we like it or not, actually kind of goes beneath all the other areas of parenting. It is a foundational aspect of the relationship between parent and child, and it's the issue of authority. And then attached to authority, kind of an aspect of authority, is discipline as well. And I actually was kind of nervous to have this conversation because authority is such a tense idea right now, it seems like.
Yeah, there's a little humor here as we're doing this. Like, after a hard topic like technology, now we're picking a nice non-controversial topic like parenting. So, no, I have some nervousness about this too. I'm a parent. I know I'm an imperfect parent. But yeah, you're right. Those two issues, authority and discipline specifically, man, they're hot button issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth everybody just stepping back for a second and recognizing part of the reason why we cringe a little bit when we talk about exercising authority, because we're in this cultural moment where there's been this huge backlash against authority of all kind, not just the authority of parents, but authority in general. And the reason is because we've seen just so many different ways that authority has been abused. Like, if you think about in the political sphere, like politicians in general, Congress, both sides of the political conversation, approval ratings are so low. No one trusts the authority that our politicians wield. We think that they're in it for themselves, that they're enriching their own families. It doesn't matter whether they're a Republican or a Democrat. We do not believe that the people in power actually have our best interests in mind. And we're probably right.
For sure. No, for sure. And it extends beyond politics, obviously, right? We are really leery of large corporations, for instance. And some of you will remember this, like growing up for me through the 80s, the Exxon Valdez, catastrophe, the oil spill up in Alaska. I mean, it was one sort of nail in the coffin that I remember and look back on, where we just said, yep, see, those big institutions, they're out for themselves, for the money, can't trust them.
Yep, and like another example, what we mentioned in our technology series is how Meta is being sued for intentionally harming kids with the way they design their social media apps to get them addicted to what's going on. I mean, so authority in the corporate world, authority in politics, but also authority in the church has really been under fire, and for good reason.
We've talked about this a lot.
Absolutely. In the Catholic Church, you have the sex abuse scandals that were really flared up about 20 years ago, but have continued in some ways today. You have evangelical megachurch pastors, getting found out to be living double lives and being sexual abusers themselves.
Scraping money off the top. Yeah.
So in so many areas of life, we look at people who have been given authority, look at people who have been given power, and we see how horrible it can be, how much it can be misused. And so really, as a culture, we've just kind of decided that authority is suspect in and of itself. That anyone who seeks authority, anybody who has authority, they're probably abusing it. They're probably misusing it. And so we in general don't like people who have a lot of power or a lot of authority. And the reason why I want to take a step back and just think about that with everyone is because in the parenting relationship, if you are a parent, you do have authority. But if you've been trained to be suspect of everyone who exercises authority, to think people who have authority are bad, are wrong, then that, even if it's subconscious, is going to give you a little bit of hesitancy to step into that role, to actually embrace the authority that you've been given. And I actually think if we can't own that, if we can't understand that, then we're going to be at a disadvantage of trying to exercise authority in a godly way, because we're not going to understand that it actually is a gift of God given to be used for the good of our kids, for the good of our families.
Where do you think that comes from? I mean, that fear, that cautiousness on our part as parents, is it just a fear like, oh man, I've seen other people screw up, I'm going to screw up too? Where do you think that comes from?
Well, maybe there's a fear of like I'm not going to be able to handle the authority well. I know I'm flawed. I know I make mistakes, and so I don't want to say anything definitive because I don't trust myself. But I actually think it's a little bit. It's not quite as noble as that, if I'm honest. I think that we think so poorly of people with authority over us that we hate to think that our kids would think that way of us. That they would look at us as the ones who have authority and have power and don't get what it's like to be not in control. Like all the complaints we have of everybody else, I think we're nervous that our kids are going to feel that way about us, and that we
Wow.
don't want to think that way. We want them to love us. We want them to like us. We want them to respect us, and we fear that using authority will make them kind of turn on us a little bit.
That's really good, Wyatt. I think you're onto something there. And I think it extends even beyond our kids. Like I've had some really self-conscious conversations before with other Christians that I know or other friends that I have where you start talking about parenting and maybe you're a little more authoritative,
Strict.
authoritarian, a little more strict than
Yeah.
they are. I mean, they look at you like you're some kind of a monster. You're some kind of freak that is irreparably harming your
They're
kids.
cool parents,
Right.
and you are losers. I mean, you are like, yeah, no fun. Your kids probably hate you, and absolutely.
And we don't want to, that self-consciousness you pointed to, I think that's really insightful because it drives us.
You can be too authoritarian. I'm not saying that you can't.
For sure.
So it's not saying that there's no danger there at all, but we do have to get over that fear because even godly authority, even authority that's being exercised perfectly, the people under your authority will actually still accuse you of that.
Yeah.
They will still bristle. And the only proof you need for that is look at God himself. I mean,
The perfect father.
who's only ever exercised authority perfectly, the entire human race is actively in rebellion against his authority. I mean, that's what sin is. And so we can't be scared that people are going to accuse us of misusing our authority, but we do have to have a healthy respect that authority also can be abused. It can be used for great harm.
For sure.
And so I want to get into that a little bit more specifically. Let's think together about how authority works in the parent relationship and what some of the dangers are. And when we come back from a break, we'll dive into that.
Great. Why, as we're talking about this, I'm sitting here again, just feeling the fact, hey, I'm an imperfect, flawed parent. And, we're getting into some of the sociological reasons that people distrust authority, I mean, which is also a little over our head. But this is clearly a biblical topic. That's why two pastors are talking about
That's the
this,
reason why
right?
we're talking about it is because this isn't just like, some sociological perspective on parenting. This is how the Bible sets up the relationship between kids and parents. And I mean, I think it's significant that in the 10 Commandments itself, when God boils down, the 10 most important things and how humans can flourish in this world, one of them is speaking to children and saying, children, it is your job to honor your parents, to respect that authority role that has been given to them. And it's not just the 10 Commandments. This comes up all over the place. Proverbs is full of all kinds of things about
Right.
The goodness that comes when parents use that authority wisely and when children respect it appropriately. It gets repeated into the New Testament as, Colossians 3:20, children obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. So God says over and over again, something's really important here in this relationship. Children, you're to obey, you're to respect, you're to submit to the authority that parents have, and vice versa. Parents, you are to use this authority in a God-honoring way.
And the Bible also casts our relationship with God till the day we die in the light of us as his children and him as a perfect father. So it's not like we ever outgrow this role. It's just that the role changes.
Well, I mean, it's important to note that when God gives us a metaphor to think about the authority he has over us, his relationship with us, he uses the human picture of parent-child. He uses father-children to help us understand how God's authority exercises itself in our relationship. And he picks that because there is this just inherent goodness to the authority that's given to parents over their kids. And so I think the question for us is, okay, if that's true, if God is intentionally giving parents authority and it's for good, what good is he intending? What's the
Right.
purpose?
I'm thinking the same thing, right? Authority is not an end in itself. It's a means to an end. So what is the end goal of authority, especially parental authority? What do you think?
Well, I would make the case that biblically, the purpose of parents, like your job as a parent, what God wants you to do with your authority in that relationship, is to raise your kids to become mature adults, to become adults who are healthy and thriving. And in the faith context, to raise your children to become adults who are mature in the faith, who love Jesus, who understand what he's done for them, who are ready to give their whole lives to the kingdom of God, following Jesus and honoring him as Lord and Savior. Like, that's the end. And now I know I'm speaking to a lot of parents out there, many of whom who have kids who aren't doing that, who they desperately want their kids to be following Jesus, and they're not. So I want parents to hear me. I'm not saying that you have total control over that as a parent. I'm not saying that if that doesn't happen, that you as a parent are a failure. But I am just saying, in the ideal, what the hope is, what the goal is, what the purpose is that you would raise your kids to become mature, and not only mature, but mature in the faith.
No, and I got to pause there for just a minute. I mean, I've had these folks in my office. You have two like brokenhearted parents who have been great parents, and their kids not only aren't doing great with them, the relationship might be broken there, but they don't see their kids following Jesus. And there's so much pain, and it's a little cliche, but I'll never forget, the first time I heard someone say, the only perfect parent that has ever existed and still exists is God himself, and his first children, Adam and Eve, chose to rebel against him. So we both don't want to lay a burden of guilt here, right?
Absolutely. And yet so often what I've seen is kind of a backlash where like we recognize that you can't control everything. We recognize that sometimes kids just go astray. And so we just kind of go like, I don't have anything to do with this. Like, God's going to do what he's going to do. My kids are going to turn out how they're going to turn out. Like, it's out of my hand. And that's actually not true either.
Well, it's more than that, right? The current prevailing wisdom, I think, is don't get in the way of them blossoming and flowering into the perfect person that they were created to be.
It's going to happen on its own.
Right.
If you don't mess it up.
Right. And your authority is probably going to mess it up.
Just chill out and step back and don't say anything and just watch what happens. And that's not right either. There's a proverb that gets quoted in this conversation more often than anything. And I think it needs a little bit of defending, if I'm honest. This is Proverbs 22:6. Start a youth out on his way, and even when he grows old, he will not depart from it. And the reason why that proverb got a little bit of a bad rap is because it was misused quite a bit about 20 years ago, where preachers would say basically to parents, what this proverb is saying is that if you start your kids on the right path, they will not depart from it. And so if your kids departed, it's your fault.
It's that interpretive principle that it is a proverb, not a promise.
Proverbs
not
not
a
promises.
guarantee.
They are truisms. They are generally true about how the world works. And so let's not reject that concept. Let's accept it. Let's say, okay, the general truth is that the job of the parent is to set out their kids on the way they should go. And in general, if you do that, there's a good chance that they will continue on that path as they grow and become adults and become mature. Not always. And they have their own choices to make and their own relationship with Jesus to forge. You can't control it. But in general, it is a very good thing for parents to intentionally set their kids on the right path. God uses that often.
That's a huge principle. And another principle that I think is just so important for us as parents. You and I are both parents at different stages, but we know the pain and the joys that come from this whole parenting thing is we walk under authority. To my point a minute ago, we never stop being God's children. And so I think kids watch how we respond to authority. Do we chafe at it? Do we buck against it and act like hypocrites? They watch close, don't they?
They do. Yeah. So we've been given this authority as parents. We're given the authority to help our kids become mature in the faith. There's so much that goes into this. We're going to continue this series and talk about all kinds of different aspects. But just as we start, I'd love to give people just a way of thinking about some of the pitfalls with authority, because authority can be abused, but it also can be abdicated. And both of those things have big consequences. And I want people to really tune into this, because we're all wired to be more prone to one of these two things than another. Some of us are just kind of wired to be more authoritarian. We want people to listen to what we say. We know what should be happening, and we're very comfortable punishing our kids, and it doesn't bother us because we're heartless people. I'm kind of talking about myself.
You are heartless.
And there's some people who are just more naturally wired to be much more sensitive, much more empathetic, and you don't ever want to.
That's me, by the way,
so there
which
you
my
go.
wife might call being a pushover. But anyway,
Yeah, so we're all kind of wired this way, and so Steve, it's very unlikely for you to fall into the temptation of abusing that authority, of being too authoritarian, of ruling with an iron fist. That's my temptation, and it's very unlikely for me to fall off the wagon by abdicating my
by
authority.
indulging.
Right, by just not caring, by just
Yeah.
being a pushover, letting them do whatever they want. Like, that's not going to happen. But
Wait. Say the tension one more time. I love the way you set that up. What's the dichotomy?
so two ways you can go wrong with authority. On one end, you can abuse it. You can hold too tightly to your power. You can overuse it. You can, really make your
Tyrannical.
kids miserable
Yeah.
by just how much control you're exerting in their life.
Yep.
On the other end, you can abdicate your authority. You can give it up. You can not exercise it. You can decide not to discipline. You can decide not to speak up.
Yeah.
You can decide to just let your kids turn out how they're going to turn out. You're going to be their friend. You're going to be kind to them. You're going to laugh with them, but you're never going to actually step into that authority role and help raise them in the way they should go. Tell them where they should go and help them get there and discipline them when they don't.
I'm thinking of our listeners right now. I mean, your brain instantly starts to populate as you say those things with examples you've seen around you, with your own personal style, with your parents.
Well, probably first, we're all thinking of all the parents we know that have fit those patterns
At
around
least
us.
I'm not. Yeah.
So hopefully we can move on from that to also think about ourselves and our
Right.
own parenting styles. And honestly,
And what a healthy
and I'm sure
parenting style
not all of
looks
our
like.
listeners are parents. All of us probably also think a little bit about our own parents of which one of them fit those categories. Often we have one of each in our marriage, not always, but often you had the parent you would go to because you knew that they were soft-hearted and they weren't really gonna discipline you or whatever. And you had the parent you hid things from because they were the disciplinarian. That's a very common dynamic in families.
We could talk for a while about that one. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So, you have these two sides, and I want to get into each of them a little bit with you because let's understand why those are temptations and what's going wrong when that happens. And let's start with the temptation to abdicate authority. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is the temptation to really be more of a friend to your kids than a
Right.
parent. And by the way, I hope people can hear me. I'm not saying that friend and parent are not overlapping categories at all. I hope especially as your kids get older, that friendship is a huge part of that relationship. But even when they're younger, friendship is a part of it. But when you abdicate the authority role, what you do is you say, actually, the friendship thing is more important than my role as parents. And so I don't want to make them upset with me. I don't want them to be mad. I don't want them to wonder why they have to follow my rules and do what I say. I just want to be their friend. I just want them to be somebody that they like to talk to.
And I think one of the underlying assumptions and beliefs behind that is my number one goal as a parent is to just make my kids happy.
Absolutely. So if what we said earlier was that, biblically, the role of parent is to bring about maturity in your kids, help them become fully functioning
Right.
adults who love Jesus.
The Proverbs really draw that out.
Yeah. The abdication, it replaces that purpose with a different one, which is what you just said. Instead of thinking that my job as a parent is to help my kids become mature, I start thinking my job as a parent is to make my kids happy. Now, again, we should stop and just describe this for a second. Every parent wants to make their kids happy.
Not you, Wyatt. You want to make them miserable. Admit it. Admit it.
If you want to make your kids unhappy, there's something wrong with you.
Something's
okay?
wrong.
But
Even for you.
when happiness becomes more prominent than maturity, when it becomes more important, when it becomes the number one goal, the only thing I want for my kids, I just want them to be happy, then that is when you will stop using authority. Because when you exercise authority, it almost never makes the person that you're exercising authority over
Not in the short run.
happy in the short term.
Right.
But there is this kind of weird upside down thing that happens. Because over the long term, if you abdicate your role of authority, if you don't discipline, if you don't correct your children firmly but lovingly when they're in sin, when you don't, tell them that they can't have everything that they want when they want it, when you don't make them learn patience, when you don't make them learn how to forgive and how not to hold grudges, when you don't make them learn humility, when you don't take that role, in the short term, you might be making them happy over and over and over and over again. But in the long term, you actually usually will end up making them miserable. And the reason is because they do actually have to leave your house one day and go out into the world. They have to build other relationships with friends, with teachers, with coworkers, with a spouse one day, with their own kids.
Whose number one interest may not be trying to make them happy.
It will not be, for sure. And if you don't do the hard work of having the conflict in your own home, of using your authority to make them learn the hard lessons early, when they go out in the world, they will not be able to find the kind of deep, real, healthy relationships with other human beings that they desperately long for. And it will really have a negative effect on their life. And here's kind of what I would offer to parents who struggle with that, who say, okay, I get it, but I don't want to make my kids mad at me. I don't want to make them sad right now.
They're going to hate me.
What I would say is, if you keep maturity the number one goal, if you embrace that you're going to have some short-term angst, you're going to have some short-term pain and conflict, but you're embracing that because you know you want your kids to become mature. In the end, you are very likely to get both things.
Right.
You're very likely to have mature kids and happy kids. And if you flip it, if you put happiness first, you're very likely to get neither. You're very likely to get unhappy, immature kids, and nothing is worth that.
Yeah, it reminds me of a scripture fairly well known out of Hebrews chapter 12. And this is talking about us looking back at our parents. You know, the author of Hebrews says, "For our parents disciplined us for a short time based on what seemed good to them, but God always benefits us for our benefit so that we can share in his holiness. No discipline seems enjoyable at the time,
Amen.
but painful. Later on, however, it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness." I mean, that's exactly what you're talking about, right? In the short run, it's not pleasant for you as a parent usually either. I mean, it can't be about your happiness either all the time, but you love that kid, so you do your best to train them in the way.
Amen. Yeah. So if this is you, if this is where your struggle is, the encouragement is embrace some of the pain. Embrace the hard conversations. Let your kid tell you how much they think you're an idiot and you aren't fair and you don't understand what it's like to be a kid and blah 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 and all that kind of stuff. Like, recognize that pain you're feeling is actually you exercising your authority in a godly way. It is being willing to take that pain for your kid so they can learn and grow and become mature in the way they need to be able to be successful as an adult. You are serving them by letting them treat you that way if you step into that authority role. Let's talk about the other side of it, though. So on one end, you have abdicating, giving up the authority, just trying to be a friend to your kids. On the other end, you have abusing the authority. It is actually relishing the role of getting to be the authoritarian.
Tell us about that, Wyatt.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I am tempted more that way. I don't like it when people disrespect me. I have no problem telling them to stop doing that. And that's my kids too, I don't feel that bad when they cry because they're being disciplined. I actually mean something to me that's happening, because to me, it makes me feel like they're getting the point of what's happening. They're understanding that what they just did is not okay. And I'm kind of like an emotionally shriveled person. So it's just really hard to make me feel bad about that kind of stuff. So
entirely
that's
true.
the temptation of that I have to resist is, okay, authority is a gift given to me, but it's not given for me. It's given for my kids. It's given for their good. And so anytime I'm exercising my authority in a way that actually isn't for their good, it's maybe for me, it's for my selfishness.
Yeah.
I'm tired of them or whatever. Like, I'm abusing it. And I think this is, when we talked earlier about how, some parents will make the happiness of their kids more important than the maturity of their kids.
Yeah.
In my camp over here, the temptation is actually to make my own happiness more important than the maturity of my kids. That I'm going to exercise my authority to get them to, not bother me or leave me alone or, whatever, or make me happy or make them fulfill my hopes and my dreams for them and become what I want them to be. Like, that's when you start to abuse your authority rather for their good to make it for your good.
Actually, I really appreciate your candor, Wyatt, because, it is hard being a parent. And I think you're right. I think, maybe there's a lean in that to protect your own happiness first, but it's not entirely true. As the guy who has a tendency the other way, I also am trying to keep my kid happy for my own happiness. So in both cases here, I think, whether it's abdication or abuse, there is a putting the happiness of myself or my child first, which, as you pointed out earlier, it just doesn't work. We're not saying happiness is bad by any means. We're saying sometimes you have to lay it aside to get it later on.
Absolutely. And there's another one of those kind of upside down aspects to this end as well, where often people who abuse their authority, they do it because they need their kids to respect them. They need their kids to
affirm that.
Yeah, recognize my role.
Right.
Recognize that I'm the parent. Listen to me, obey me.
Validate, respect. Yeah.
And very similarly to what we talked about before, If you overuse your power, if you abuse it, very likely you will have kids who grow up and no longer respect you. You might think you have it in the short term because they do what you say, but when they grow up and they leave the house, they will look back and they will not have respect for you because they won't think that you actually cared and loved them like you were supposed to. They'll see that actually you were really taking care of yourself.
And I mean, another thought comes to mind for just how this doesn't work. I've seen parents in the supermarket, where they start with the abdicate role. They're trying to placate their kids. Johnny, if you just be quiet, Mommy's going to get you a candy bar. Be good. I'm going to buy you that bag of Oreos. When we get home, you can watch 6 episodes of Bluey. Whatever. They're placating, pacifying, and the kid's not going there at all. Kid keeps, and then suddenly mom just flies off the handle, embarrasses herself in front of 40 people, smacks the kid. And so, I'm not just trying to say it always goes like that, but just there's so many pitfalls when we put our happiness or our kids' happiness first.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, this is helpful. I hope it's been helpful for others. I've really been learning a lot in just this study as I'm a parent right now with 2 young kids and trying to figure this out. But let's dive a little bit more specifically. So we're talking about authority in general, but when we come back from a break, let's get into one of the specific ways that authority gets exercised. And that's how we discipline our kids. And we'll kind of use that as a case study. All right, Steve, so we're going to try to get a little bit more practical for a moment. We're talking about kind of theory about authority and different pitfalls, but let's get into the weeds here and talk about what every parent has to deal with, which is how to discipline your kids. Your kids do something wrong, they disobey, they lie, they hit, they steal, they whatever, and it is your job to discipline. What should we do? How do we do that? What does it look like? And so I just want to start and just remind us where we come from. So we're going to get into the how, we're going to get into the practical. Let's go back to the purpose. Your purpose as a parent is to raise your kids to become mature followers of Jesus. Maturity is what we're shooting for. Mm-hmm. And so if that's what is driving us, what strategies?
Could we even say mature children of God?
Absolutely.
We're supposed to be as adults.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And now, before we jump in, I think what everybody's waiting for is we're about to hear Wyatt and Steve's take on spanking and corporal punishment. And I can't wait to hear which side of things are going to cancel.
How about those Seahawks?
Yeah, exactly. Seriously, that's not what this is about. We're not going to take a huge stand on corporal punishment. I think just briefly, every once in a while, somebody will go to Proverbs 13:24 and say the Bible mandates that you spank your children. It says the one who will not use the rod hates his son, but the one who loves him disciplines him diligently. And I'm just going to say briefly that proverb is not talking about what mode of discipline to use. It's not saying the only Christian way to discipline is with a rod. It is saying that actually discipline itself is a huge part of parenting. If you won't discipline, then you hate your kids. If you do discipline diligently, then you do it out of love. But I also would add in just a little bit to that, which is it does seem at the very least that the Bible does not forbid corporal punishment, that it seems within the realm of what's acceptable potentially for parents to use corporal punishment. But we're not going to take a huge stand on what's most effective or what parents should do or any of that.
But I'm thinking of some people who, like me, might be thinking even of a recent thing I saw in my newsfeed. There was this well-known vlogger, influencer. Her name's Ruby Frank, and she made a name for herself giving parenting advice. And long story short, she is now in jail because her 12-year-old escaped and reported his abusive mom, who was doing all kinds of physically horrible and psychologically horrible things to her kids. So, I bring that up just to say it's a very live topic, and it is frightening to read what happens when discipline and punishment goes awry, when it is abused. So you and I take it seriously, right? We're not just being flippant here.
That's what we're listening to. I mean, if you are somebody who is on that end of the spectrum where your temptation is abuse of authority, and you're also somebody who believes strongly in corporal punishment, just recognize that is maybe the single biggest area where you can massively screw up your relationship with your kids.
Strong word of caution.
If you use corporal punishment out of anger, if you go too far, if you don't have the self-control, your kids will believe that you're not disciplining out of love, that you're disciplining out of hate.
Yeah, why in an era that I grew up in when spanking wasn't so stigmatized, the joke or at least the line was always when the parent would spank the child, they would say, "This is going to hurt me more than it hurts you." And as a kid, you're going, "Yeah, right."
Yeah, I
But I
heard that
mean,
one.
it
Yeah.
goes back to the why before we get to the how, right? If you are spanking out of anger, out of selfishness, your kid sees that, you are probably doing more damage, more harm than good.
Yeah. So we're not going to get a huge stand on the how. There's a bunch of ways to discipline. It changes as your kids grow, and different seasons require different things. But as we get into kind of the nitty gritty, whether you believe in corporal punishment or not, whatever you pick as your punishment, you better pick something that your kids care about. Like you do have to realize
It's got to hurt.
the purpose of discipline is to cause some sort of pain, some sort. I
Right.
don't mean physical pain, but I mean like it is to associate inappropriate behavior with a bad outcome. That is how you are training your kid to go in the way they should, to associate in their minds when I do this bad thing, when I go down this wrong path, it doesn't turn out well for me. And so you have to pick something that actually communicates that. If you're picking something to discipline your kids that they don't care that much about, you're not actually doing it. You're pretending. It's like a charade. You know, my daughter Hazel she was our firstborn, you know, first couple years of her life. She was an only child. And she is the most independent little kid I've ever seen. She doesn't care if she's by herself. She asks to go to her room and play with her toys by herself and shut the door. She asks quite a bit now because Thatcher's not that fun to hang out with sometimes. He hits her a lot. So she just wants to be in her room by herself. Because of that,
He's dealing out corporal punishment.
yeah, exactly. Time out is not a very effective punishment for Hazel. Like, she doesn't care. I say, you're in timeout, go to your room. She just skips down the hallway and goes and plays with her toys in her room. So as I'm thinking about, okay, what discipline is really going to matter to her? I need to pick something that actually is going to communicate the point that this isn't okay, that this hurts when you choose this course of action. Whatever it is for your kids, you got to pick something that matters.
Yeah, I could address this anecdotally too. I mean, I had one kid where all you had to do was look at her with a hint of disapproval, and she was, you know, a puddle of tears. So, I mean, the point here is we want, like you said, to make a point, and that's probably going to mean it's going to hurt, but every kid's different. We were talking about this a little bit earlier, you know, and for people who want to get really theological about this, even look at God in the Old Testament. He disciplined his people in different ways. It might have been a plague. It might have been a drought. It might have been all kinds of different things. And he enumerates those. He talks about those throughout, especially the minor prophets. But he's creative to an end. And again, what we're saying here is the same thing we said about authority. Like, discipline has to serve an end. It's not a means in itself.
Yeah, that's great. I think another thing for me that I would think about in the practical for discipline is to think really hard about what is going to justify discipline in your family, when you're going to choose to use this tool in your tool belt. And in particular, I mean, I'm thinking of just the way that the Bible talks about how God disciplines the ones he loves. Discipline is an act of love. It is for your kids' good, which means you don't want to just use it all like whenever you feel like it or for any random thing. Like, you really want to ask the question, is my child's is goodness for them, is their maturity, is their health, is this worth stepping into for their own good, or is this just my own anger, my own disappointment, my own frustration? I haven't had my cup of coffee this morning.
Right. My need for rest to watch the football game, whatever.
And so because of that, like, you know, I talked about how I am more on the authoritarian side just as a makeup. One of the things that's a challenge for me is I want to have as few rules as I need to have. I don't want to just control my kids all the time. Like, I want to say yes. I want to give freedom as much as I can and only use discipline sparingly when they're actually sinning, when they're actually in the wrong, not just because I would rather they do X, Y, Z, or, you know, I wish that they were more this way or that way or whatever.
Inconvenience isn't something you want to punish.
Correct. So try to say yes. When you can't, when your kids are actually doing something wrong, that's what calls for discipline. And then, you know, another just really practical matter is if discipline is designed to raise a child in the way they should go, consistency in how you implement it is so big. You're trying to help your kids learn how the world works, learn right and wrong, learn that, okay, every time I hit, I get punished because hitting is wrong. You know, every time I lie to my parents, I get punished because lying is wrong. if you aren't consistent, if sometimes you get really mad and you dole out a huge punishment, and then most of the time you let it go, your kids are never going to learn what you're trying to communicate. They're never going to learn what actually right and wrong is. They're going to learn that you are capricious and
Yep.
that they don't know how you're going to respond to things because they can't predict you. And that often leads to just really dysfunctional relationships between parents and kids.
And every parent who's hearing this, myself included, just takes a big gulp of humility right there because we know we're often not consistent. But, another area where we have to be so careful that we're being consistent is not actually doing the thing we're trying to stop. I mean, how many times have you seen a parent scream at a kid to be quiet?
Yes.
Or get angry at a kid and say, stop being angry. Like, I think more damage is done by our hypocrisy, which would be another way of saying inconsistency, than almost anything else we do as parents.
And also, I mean, that hypocrisy, that consistency, like recognize that your kids are going to fight back. Like
Just expect it.
when you set up rules, when you set up how discipline is going to work, they're going to push those boundaries. And so what that means is make sure that you're only implementing rules, that you're only setting up discipline that you are actually willing to follow through with. If you're making threats that you won't actually do, your kids will find that out so quickly.
They see right through it every time.
And again, like, it's not just that that's annoying as a parent when that happens, but once again, like that isn't effective in helping them become mature. It isn't effective in helping them learn the right and wrong and how the world works and what it means to honor Jesus with their life. And then one more thing I would say is discipline shouldn't be the first act. It shouldn't be the first resort. What is actually going to help your kids grow into maturity? Your positive example.
Yes, it's huge.
Your positive reinforcement of their behavior. You calling out the good in them. You seeing the way that God's wired them, the kindness that they show, and the obedience. When you praise that, when you say yes, like this is who God made you to be. Keep doing that.
Oh, that's so good, Wyatt.
That actually has more influence, has more weight, and when that far outweighs the discipline, like that's the kind of balance that you want. Now, I will fully admit that's not always true for our household, and at different seasons require different things. Sometimes your kids are really pushing boundaries, and it's gonna be hard to find that balance. But if you can strive for that as a parent, if you can strive to, like, I am going to intentionally look for the good. I'm going to intentionally try to call out what I love that I see in them so that they know that I really am for them. I really love them. Like when I discipline, it's still out of love, but I'm their biggest fan. I love who God made them to be. That's really going to help the discipline when you have to give it out as well.
It's really interesting to look at the ways, again, I mentioned this earlier, God in the Old Testament, we get a lot of examples of him disciplining and correcting. And early on, like Genesis chapter 4, Cain, he does not give God the righteous sacrifice that God asked for. We're not even told how that went down, but he didn't bring the right one. And God comes to Cain and he says, Cain, why are you angry? Why do you look despondent? If you do what's right, won't you be accepted? And I just think you can hear the parent heart of God. Cain, it's okay. Calm down. I'm not mad. I want you to do what's right. I mean, this sounds so simple, but it's so hard, right? But this is the heart of God. He always corrects us for our good. He's patient, and we're still adults learning to be children of God now, and it's never going to be easy.
That's great. Well, we have to leave people here. Man, I love that you keep coming back to humility. Same perspective for me. So much that I'm saying here that I need to do a better job of actually living out in my own parenting, and no doubt people who are hearing this, who are parents, feel that as well. And so I'd love just for you to leave us with an encouragement. We've all failed. We've all fallen short. We all need more wisdom. How do you want to leave us today?
I'm here in Genesis, and there's an interesting pattern we see in the Bible. We see, in the garden when God made us to thrive and live with him, he walked with us in the cool of the day. We actually see God with Adam naming the animals. I mean, there's this beautiful relationship, and that's what we were meant for. But when sin enters the world, it's weird. Like suddenly God becomes much more strict. And as you read through the early parts of the Pentateuch, it seems like all God does is give these rules and stuff. But you notice a tendency, like in Abraham, one of the first followers of God that we see, it's late in his life where God says, Abraham is my friend. It's late when Jesus is leaving the disciples. He leaves them and he says, you're not just my followers, you're my friends. And I want to hold that out to parents, right? I mean, the goal is what we see in the garden, that friendship, that intimacy, that closeness. Because we live in a sinful, fallen world, we are going to have to discipline, make some hard choices. But the goal is friendship, just not at first.
Yeah.
It takes a while
Comes
to
later.
get there.
Yeah. That's a good word, Steve. Well, thanks, man. It's been a good conversation.
Really enjoyed it. Thank you again for joining us on this episode of Native Exiles. These are tough topics. They're tough for us. We assume they're probably tough for you too. Trying to be honest and humble and just seek God's wisdom in all this. Thanks for hanging with us, working with us through these tough topics. We really appreciate you following us, telling your friends about the podcast, and we will always look forward to seeing you again on Native Exiles.